You are listening to the FORSCOM Frontline, bringing you to our soldiers on the front lines of readiness. Welcome back to the FORSCOM Frontline. I'm Ashley, and I'm your host. We've spent a lot of time over the last couple of months really diving into all aspects of readiness. And while our topic today does directly affect readiness, that really isn't our focus. So first, joining me to help host this episode is Kelsey Hurt, and she is our FORSCOM Suicide Prevention Response and Analysis Coordinator. And she's been on the podcast before, but as a guest. And so I asked her to join me because she's way smarter than me on this topic. So I need her help. So welcome, Kelsey, and thanks for doing this with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited as always. Anytime we get to talk suicide prevention, I'm all in.
So it's been a little while since we've had you on. So before we go to our guest, I just wanted to quickly ask you, are there any updates from the FORSCOM suicide prevention side that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think the line that I used last time in the podcast was, fortunately or unfortunately, we have so much going on in the suicide prevention space. So I'll just hit some quick highlights. We've really seen some great efforts across Forces Command and across the Army to really curb the suicide problem. One of the great things that we've been seeing is, and it's out at Fort Riley's Operation Victory Wellness, the utilization of those non-clinical and clinical resources to really get to those issues, if any, early. And that kind of goes along with really FORSCOM's efforts to pivot from the response or the intervention and response to the prevention side. Along those same lines, we did just complete the Vice's suicide prevention chain teach. So really getting all those leaders engaged, from our 4-star generals down to our squad level leaders, and really making sure that everyone's taking the time to get to know their soldiers, and really just spend some time team building and building trust as well. All really important protective factors for suicide prevention.
Absolutely.
And then I'll just quickly mention that, I guess it was last Friday now, on the 1st of April, General Garrett held his suicide fatality review board with leaders across Forces Command. And not only did we get a brief from the Department of the Army Analytics team about some of those FORSCOM unique equities regarding suicides and the operational force, but we also had a wonderful financial brief from Ms. Robin out at Army G9, again, trying to get after those protective factors and upstream to those prevention efforts.
Yeah, and, two of the things you mentioned, first, Victory Wellness. We had Major General Sims on the podcast earlier this year, and what they have going on out there is amazing. And I told him the idea of having soldiers have to go meet with a counselor so they're exposed to that is just, I think, a really great program. And then we also just had on earlier this month, Robin, who gave the financial brief during our meeting. So she's wonderful as well. And she has a ton of great information and she's super enthusiastic. So it was great to talk to her and listen to her.
Yeah, really great efforts. Like I said, going across priority and really putting their all into this. So yeah, it's important.
Well, and I didn't get to talk to her about this, but the whole connection between suicide and financial stress. We talked more about the resources available to help soldiers, but I actually hope to get her back so we can talk about that whole tie together, because I think that is really important and something that I don't know that you think about very often, although we've talked quite a bit and it is a major stressor.
Yeah, I mean, that along with relationships and work stress, all of those are really important to try to get to early on, and work on those coping skills, those communication skills, and really try to plan ahead for some of those life events that we know are coming up.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and bring in our guest. And I've said this before, but we've spent a good amount of time discussing suicide on the podcast. And while that is our focus today, we're actually taking a little bit of a different approach when we're looking at it. We're joined by Dr. Bryan, and he is a board-certified clinical psychologist in cognitive behavioral psychology. He is a stress, trauma, and resilience professor of psychiatry and behavioral health at The Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center and is the division director for recovery and resilience. While serving in the Air Force, Dr. Bryan deployed to Iraq in 2009, where he served as the director of the Traumatic Brain Injury Clinic at the Air Force Theater Hospital. He separated from active duty shortly after his deployment and started researching PTSD, suicidal behaviors, and suicide prevention strategies in psychological health and resiliency. Well, welcome, Dr. Bryan, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me and Kelsey today.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me.
I know that you've recently spent a lot of time with FORSCOM soldiers, and so I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about those visits. So I'm just going to start with, I've read over your bio, and you've done a lot and continue to do a lot with service members and veteran. And I know you're a veteran yourself, but can you talk about what led you to focus so much of your career on suicide and PTSD?
Yeah. I guess, so I was in graduate school training to be a psychologist before I joined the military and was, interested in suicide and trauma at that time. But I eventually commissioned, finished up my graduate training as a psychologist on active duty, served my commitment. And in 2009, I deployed to Iraq. And while I was deployed, I think that was really where my sort of understanding of trauma and suicide really changed, became more personal at that time. And I think, specific to the case of suicide, to be frank, it was the first time as a psychologist that I really kind of came face to face with, kind of the brutality of suicide. In our hospital, we treated gunshot wound victims, self-inflicted gunshot wound victims. And so, as a psychologist, and I think for many of us, suicide is something that happens somewhere else, it happens in someone's home, things like that. And it's definitely true for mental health professionals. And so kind of seeing kind of face to face the reality of suicide, it definitely, is definitely transformative for me, really cemented my resolve, my commitment to suicide prevention.
Okay.
And then I know Ashley had just mentioned that you had spoken to a number of the command teams within FORSCOM footprint and, about suicide and suicide prevention. And I know you're scheduled actually, I think next week to talk to all the FORSCOM commanders, which we're really looking forward to as well. What has your message been to them?
I would say that, the overriding message was that we probably need to rethink how we approach suicide. And to do that, we need to rethink what suicide is in and of itself. I think we've historically thought of suicide as a symptom of mental illness or this outcome that's caused by mental illness. But research doesn't really support that all that much. And we know that actually the majority of service members who die by suicide do not have a mental health condition. And so that's been a lot of the research that we've conducted over the past 10 years or so with the military to kind of lead us to this place that perhaps part of the reason we've not been more effective at suicide prevention in the military is because we're sort of shooting at the wrong target. We don't fully understand suicide, and if we redirect our focus and our aim, I think we would be much more successful.
So I'm curious, how do you think we should redirect that? Me and Kelsey sit in a lot of meetings and we talk about, some of the stressors, the financial stress, the relationships. Kelsey, jump in with the ones that I'm missing.
Yeah, work stress and sleep and,
all of those different things. And so is this a valid thing? Are we thinking about the right things?
So all those are risk factors for sure. And they can sometimes lead to suicide, but most of the time they don't, right? I mean, 99% of the time those things do not result in suicide. And so that's sort of the conundrum that I think many of us have been contending with, is that these things that are, kind of associated with increased risk for suicide at the same time very rarely lead to suicide. And so there's kind of like three, I think, kind of key directions that I think we can take to probably improve our efforts. The first of which is on the mental health treatment side. So there's some people who die by suicide who do have a mental health condition. They have depression or anxiety, things like that, and they go to the MTF, they go to the hospital on base to receive care. What we've learned and what we've been able to show over the past decade is that there are newer types of treatments, newer types of therapies, non-medication therapies that are actually really, really good at preventing suicidal behaviors amongst military personnel. So we've shown that things like cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention reduces suicide attempts by about 60% or more amongst active duty personnel as compared to more traditional therapies. So there's one piece is just changing the therapies, doing the things that are more effective. The second thing that we're learning is changing the environment. I think the third rail of suicide prevention, one issue that we've largely ignored is that access to highly lethal methods of suicide increase the likelihood of bad outcomes during an acute crisis. And in particular in the military, about 70% of our suicides involve firearms.
Right.
And so easy, ready access to loaded weapons increases the likelihood of a fatal outcome, whereas very simple strategies like just locking up and securing our home firearms in safes using locking devices can actually prevent suicide. And then third, I think the other kind of big miss is recognizing that suicide is partly about quality of life. So when you're talking about things like relationship problems, work stress, these are things when we experience these problems that it's sort of like it reduces kind of the attractiveness of living, right? And I think, when people are experiencing that suicidal crisis, they're kind of on this tipping point. It's like, do I live or do I die?
Sure.
And if it doesn't seem like it's worth living, then suicide becomes more probable. And so being able to address these sort of everyday stressors and problems, they're not big traumas or anything, but by sort of making life worth living, that I think can help to tip someone towards or away from suicide when they're on that precipice.
Absolutely. So you already alluded a little bit to my next questions, but I know that you have spoke with specifically some soldiers at the 101st about weapons storage. And so I know you said, locking up the lethal means can make all of the difference. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So interestingly, some of our traditional assumptions about suicide are that, it's about how upset somebody is, or we use this term called intent. How much do they want to die? And that primarily determines whether or not someone's going to kill themselves. That's actually not really well supported. The strongest sort of determinant or correlate of death after a suicide attempt is how convenient is a highly lethal method. So firearms, something, service members are much more likely than civilians to have firearms. I mentioned before 70% of our suicides involve firearms. Interestingly, another way of looking at it, over 85% of gun deaths among service members are suicides. So gun fatality in the military is basically all about suicide.
Yeah.
So it's hard to really address suicide prevention without talking about firearms. And the reason why pretty simple strategies like using gun safes, using gun locks, kind of storing things out of sight unloaded makes a difference. It's based on the same principle that something as simple as locking the doors of your house deters crime.
Yeah.
Locking your car door oftentimes keeps someone from stealing stuff out of your car,
Sure.
even though it's easy to smash the window, right? It's like it's just inconvenient enough.
Yeah.
That someone says, well, it's locked. I guess I won't do that. And that same principle seems to be true then when it comes to firearms. So it's contradictory to what most people think, which is if someone wants to kill themselves badly enough, they'll find another way. And so locking up the guns won't make a difference. Well, it's actually does make a difference for the same reason that, again, locking your doors is enough to deter someone from breaking in or getting it into mischief of some form or fashion.
Yeah. I've always thought that was so interesting, that fact, just putting the time between the thought and the access to the lethal means. It makes a difference.
Yeah, it does. It's because we know. So here's some more research that we've learned in the military. Over half of service members who attempt suicide they basically make the decision on the same day within a few hours of acting. So there's a pretty narrow window of time between when they say I'm going to do it and it actually happens. What we know is that those periods of peak distress tend to only last a few minutes, maybe a few hours at most. And so if you think of just a few minutes of someone being really, really upset or really distressed, just that little bit of a slowdown maybe is just enough to get past the peak and to start kind of coming back down. And that's the whole point, is just to kind of slow someone down, make it inconvenient enough. And that few seconds or few minutes actually can save a life.
Yeah.
And especially for FORSCOM, I know you gave us some of the Army and military stats, but when you pull out FORSCOM, we see that, suicide by privately owned weapons is also even higher. We're looking at 75, 78%. And that's a massive increase over the last 2 years, where we were in the, high 50s, low 60s. So, this is so important. And all the time we get leaders saying, hey, give us evidence-based or evidence-informed suicide prevention efforts. And here it is, with this access to lethal means. But we still struggle to get some of that traction. So again, I know you talked about gun locks, but are there other options for some individuals, peers, leaders, and family members to assist with that access to lethal means piece?
Yeah, there's actually quite a lot of options. And I'll admit, over the past several years, as I've done more and more of this work, I'm constantly learning new strategies, and I learn them from service members. I learn them from the gun owners. And because oftentimes we ask the question, well, if locking it up isn't going to work, if you don't have a safe, what's something else you can do? And there's some pretty creative ways that people have been able to accomplish the goal using, whatever they have available at home. People will use like Pelican cases. They use other lock boxes that they have. Some people will dismantle their firearm and, like, say, give a component to a friend. Others will. Some people will go so far as to actually have a friend or a trusted person, actually possess or keep the firearms for a limited period of time. It's kind of like, designated driver, right? You give your keys to someone when you're drunk, so that you don't have a bad outcome when you're driving. It's kind of the same idea. Hey, I'm not in a great place right now. I'll give you this sort of potentially dangerous tool or weapon temporarily. And so, there's kind of been a nice range of options. And, so I think a lot of it is, if you think of the principle really of being sort of like slowing a person down, kind of placing a barrier, then there's lots of different ways to do that. Now, the one last thing I'll say, though, is that, the counterpoint to that, what a lot of people are worried about, is they own and possess firearms for home protection, home security. And so they're like, well, yeah, if I can't get to my firearm right away, that's a problem, right? And I think that's a great point. And so we found, interestingly enough, now kind of a newer, more popular strategy is like these biometric safes. You can get actually small little kind of lock boxes, storage containers, things like that, about the size of a handgun. That's what most people use for home security, is a handgun. And it's like a fingerprint, and you put your fingerprint on, which is nice, especially if you're a parent, because if you don't want your kids to have access to firearms without your permission, you can actually set them up as well for this added safety precaution as well. So, and some of these things now, they'll even connect to like your smartphone. You can connect it to an app on your smartphone. Again, it's nice because if someone's trying to get in, like, let's say your kid's trying to get into to access a firearm without your permission while you're at work, it'll send you a push notification, say someone's trying to get into your guns right now. So there's I don't know, there's lots of different ways, and I think there's a lot of flexibility in how we can increase home safety for people.
And I think too, this is about protecting yourself, but this is responsible gun ownership as well. And I don't know, just being responsible. I had another thought, but it left me.
Well, the millennial in me loves the technological advances that make so much sense.
There's just so many
can
options.
really make a big impact.
Well, it's sort of funny. I heard someone joke once. They're like, "Oh, I guess there really is an app for everything now." I'm like, "Yes, there's now an app to even secure your firearms." But it's interesting with the military on this topic as well, because a lot of these precautions that we're talking about, we do this routinely in our lives in the military. You go out to the firing range, you got to do your qualifications, marksmanship training, things like that. We have all these rules at the firing range to, prevent accidents, to prevent injury, death, things like that. We secure the weapons in our armories on base in very particular ways, or all these kind of policies and SOPs around that. But it's sort of like as soon as we leave the gate at the end of the day, we sort of like throw all of that out the window, and we don't take many of the same precautions at home. And so it's kind of interesting that there is this, sometimes I think, this sort of barrier of the things that are totally natural and logical to us at work. We don't necessarily apply that same logic at home.
So Kelsey, I think we're over to you again.
Okay. And the one phrase we also hear, kind of stepping away from the lethal means piece, but we hear it a lot after a suicide. I never saw this coming. I never thought this person would hurt themselves. How can we encourage soldiers to speak up and ask for help, or better recognize that someone is going through something? And I'm going to put a little bit of a caveat on this question, because my personal interest, I would say, take me down through, universal prevention and individualized prevention, but definitely kind of what people are going through and how do we encourage them?
Yeah, well, I think, the issue of like warning signs is tricky, because I think what you're getting at there is there probably, I'm not even going to say problem, there are definitely instances of suicides where there were not detectable or meaningful warning signs. And that, I know, is probably a provocative statement, because like the whole enterprise is around, if you didn't see any warning signs, you just weren't paying attention, is almost kind of like the attitude we have. But I don't think that's the case. And I found it helpful to kind of think about how to frame this with thinking of other sort of tragic deaths. So think of something like car crashes, like fatal car crashes. Oftentimes the warning signs for a fatal car crash, you can't really see it well in advance. Someone might get T-boned, right? Or they hit a patch of black ice on the highway and they spin out. And by the time you see those warning signs, the crash has already happened. And so I think that's kind of important for us to realize, because there are some suicides where a person does kind of have an incremental progression towards it. They're talking about how they don't want to be around anymore. They kind of feel like, I can't take this anymore. Our research has shown that things like, I don't deserve to be forgiven. I deserve to be punished. Nothing is going to help me solve my problems. Those are pretty useful indicators that someone definitely is not doing well, and that suicide might be on the horizon. And so I think being alert to those sorts of verbalizations, because they don't involve the S word, right? It's not necessarily that someone is going to say, I'm going to kill myself, I'm thinking about suicide. We're finding it's more common for them to say these other things like, I can't take this anymore. I just, I can't handle this. Those are important warning signs, and act there, and be kind of alert to that, what I like to call the coded language of suicide. That's much more likely to be what we're going to hear in our friends, our family members, and our peers.
So, we've observed this problem for years now. And in your opinion, what do you think are some of the top actions we as FORSCOM or even the Army can take to try to prevent suicide? And that's a big question.
Yeah, it is. And, it's always hard to answer. And I recently, just published a new book called Rethinking Suicide, and kind of tackle this issue. And one of the kind of the key arguments that I make is that we always kind of look for what's the thing that we can do. And there is no the thing. There's multiple things, because there are multiple pathways to suicide. There are multiple sort of types of suicide. Now, having said that, I think there's a handful of things that can be done. And I do think, first and foremost, the single easiest thing that we could be doing at scale is really talking about access to lethal methods. So definitely firearms, how we store firearms, how we keep them in our homes, being willing, when we know that a friend, family member, loved one, someone is going through a rough patch, offering to temporarily hold their firearms, to provide them, if they don't have safes or locking device, provide that for them, take that step. I think those are some of the key things. Medications as well. Many of us have, just sort of leftover meds in our home. And so, either dispensing of them appropriately, locking them up, just so that they're not quite as easily available in large quantities, is another very easy thing that we could be doing to prevent suicides. And then I think the last part of it is something newer that we're learning, is that, again, it's not always the case that people are going to, again, say, I want to die, I want to kill myself. But they have these other sorts of indicators where it's the sense, it's sort of like, I just feel like I'm on the edge, like I can't take it anymore. I'm sort of at my wit's end. Those are oftentimes more subtle indicators that someone might be at risk. And so being alert to that, I think sometimes we wait for the word suicide or the word death to come out, and then we act. And by then, sometimes it might be too late. So I think those are maybe three of the key things that very easily right away we could be doing, that don't really cost a lot of money, but could have a really big impact.
So I want to circle back to something you said earlier. Actually, you talked about value of life. And so can you expand on that a little bit? Because I know that is something that our Vice Chief of Staff of the Army has started talking about as well. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on it and what it means to you, really.
So if we go back to, I mentioned before that we've traditionally thought of suicide as like a symptom or outcome of mental illness, and that doesn't actually really seem to be a very helpful way of thinking about suicide. There's now a growing body of research showing that suicide's more usefully thought of as what we would call a health behavior. Health behaviors are like things like smoking, drinking, safe sex, things like that, where it's definitely it's an action that's taken that might impact your well-being. And so decisions like that, actions of that sort, are influenced by, motivations, by reinforcements, by rewards, by punishments. And that seems to be a key aspect of suicide. And so, when you think of suicide, it sort of brings us to death, right? It results in death. And most, we kind of are programmed to avoid death, right? So death is threatening. And so just biologically, we've been programmed to stay alive. But what can happen is, over time, for some people, life or living becomes punishing. Living becomes threatening. This is where I think things like the relationship failures, financial strain, disciplinary action, things like that come into play, where now, in essence, the alternative to suicide, the alternative to death, is living. But if living is punishing, if it's aversive, it's not really quite so attractive anymore, right? It doesn't have as much perceived value. Then the last thing that we're learning is, so suicide is not actually motivated by the desire to die. People typically don't attempt suicide because they want to be dead. They attempt suicide because they don't want to experience that aversive, punishing, stressful situation anymore. So it's the eject button. And so under this sort of mixture of circumstances, if suicide starts to become appealing as the eject button, it's sort of like, now this person has this decision that they're confronted with. Death is kind of intimidating. Living seems really miserable and punishing. Here is this strategy that I might be able to employ to get away from it. Okay. And so I know it's kind of a long answer, but that's really kind of where this whole fitting of, life being worth living is a key part. And so there are things at an institutional level, at a community level, that can potentially be changed so that if a person finds himself on that tipping point, what we want them to be able to do is say, well, living is worth it. It might be unfortunate. It's going to be stressful. We're all human. There's going to be some downsides to it, but there are things about living that are inherently rewarding that I want, that I want to have. And so we have to then, what that means is eliminate things from, the community, the environment that kind of degrade the value of living. And we want to promote and do things that encourage and increase quality of life.
Kelsey?
I was going to say, I think that goes, I think that kind of covered one of our last questions on the socioeconomic public health approach, and what that looks like, and what that could mean with really the Army's effort and FORSCOM's effort specifically to pivot from this intervention and response to those protective factors of connectedness and belongingness, and whether it's community, whether it's spirituality, making sure that we are, again, setting them up for that success of a life worth living. So I know I don't have any other questions on my end, but Ashley, I wanted to kick it back over to you to make sure I covered what I was supposed to cover.
Well, so I was actually, it's funny, I was going to kick it over to you because we are running out of time. So since you are my suicide prevention expert, I wanted to give you another opportunity if there's anything else you wanted to ask Dr. Bryan before we run out of time.
So I could probably ask Dr. Bryan, I could ask you a million questions and still have more questions to come. But I just want to say thank you for taking this time. And I really want to hit on two of the points that you made about actions we could take when we're talking about, access to lethal means. I encourage both program managers, individuals, families, go out in your community and see what's out there. And especially for our Compo 2 and Compo 3 soldiers, where you have local sheriff's office that sometimes are distributing gun locks, or on post with medicines, you have Operation Med Drops. So again, just increasing those touch points to do better on access to lethal means. I would encourage everyone to go out there and do that. And then, just stay engaged is kind of my other touch point. And I know everyone's like, oh my gosh, leader engagement. Well, it doesn't just have to be leaders, peer engagement with each other is so huge. And we've talked about, again, this burdensomeness and connectedness, and how that can impact individuals and their path to suicide. So if that's my plea at the end of this podcast, it would be for everyone to go, shake someone new's hand, give them a hug, say hi, learn about them, and let's do better. Let's take another step in the right direction.
Yeah. Dr. Bryan, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. It's nice to talk to somebody who isn't necessarily, down the hall in our building, is out of the Army in a sense. I know you still do a ton with the military, but it's get that outsider perspective. I think it's wonderful. But before we let you go, I just want to give you an opportunity for some final thoughts. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you think is important?
Well, I guess the only other thing I would say is, on the quality of life issue. I mean, I think what this means is that it's like little things really do, count. It's, it's doing things together with your family, with your group. It's scheduling downtime. It's, if you're a senior NCO, CGO, something like that. It's, having barbecues, with the unit. It's these morale activities. It's addressing, issues of, toxic leadership, toxic peers, it's accountability. Those are the things that sort of wear people down. And if we can address those things, we can not only promote and strengthen the positive, but also target the negative that, sort of kind of brings all of us down. all of that contributes to suicide prevention. It isn't just about, constantly asking each other, are you going to kill yourself? And then let's take you over to mental health.
Sure.
I mean, it's really treating each other with dignity and respect, and doing things that are valuable and worthwhile.
Yeah. You just reminded me of a conversation I had, and it was for the podcast, and I can't remember who it was, but we were talking about people just want to feel like you care about them. Like, yes, this is a job, but I want to know that you have my best interest at heart, and talk to me like I'm a person. So yeah, we've definitely talked about this before, but I appreciate your time. I appreciate you talking with us. Kelsey, any last words?
No, thank you.
Yes, thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
We really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
We'll be back next week with an episode about the 3rd Infantry Division's Marne Guardian program. We'll talk about what it is, why it's important, and how it aims to build stronger communities. In the meantime, you can find all things FORSCOM on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can also find full video episodes of each podcast on YouTube. Just search for the FORSCOM Frontline. We'll see you next time on the Frontline.